understand the economy, you have to understand human nature.
This podcast is powered by Acast.
Hi there, John here. Today we're bringing you another special episode in our series of conversations recorded at the Dalkey Book Festival. Max sat down with Nathan Thrall, who's the author of A Day in the Life of Abdel Salami. This is the true story of a Palestinian boy, a tragic accident, his family, and the daily humiliation of the Palestinian people. This is an incredible and heartbreaking insight into the life of the average Palestinian. With so much cruelty, there's also so much love, courage, and resolve. This is a conversation you really need to hear.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
Nathan, can I just ask you, how does a young man from California, an American Jewish man, end up in Jerusalem and end up writing a book like this?
Yeah. Well, you know, it wasn't planned this way, but I had a tragic accident in my own family that brought me to Jerusalem. I had my grandparents were very close to me. They were Soviet emigres to the United States, and I was born just a few years after they came. And they raised me as much as my own parents and were coming to visit me. I was living in Los Angeles, and on their way home, they got in an accident, drove off the side of the road. My grandfather survived and my grandmother didn't. And it kind of upended my life, my family's life. I moved back to the Bay Area where my family was. And during that time, my mom said to me, you know, you're grieving, you've quit your job. There are these free trips to Israel, and your grandmother always wanted to live with you in Jerusalem. And I had actually never heard my grandmother say this, but I decided to go, and these were trips, I didn't even know this name at the time, but these were the famous birthright trips, which are these very well-financed trips to try and inculcate identification with Israel among Jews in the diaspora, not just in the United States, but all over the world. So I went on this trip, and I was deeply grieving my grandmother at that time, and kind of hard to separate what was grief for my grandmother and what was just really being taken by the place. But I was hooked when I came, and immediately kind of changed my career path, went to graduate school, studied political science, and as soon as I finished that, I moved back and began working as a journalist in Israel, and came back to New York for a few years, and then wrote an article about what was a very popular thing at the time, was this notion of Fayyadism. So this was the Palestinian prime minister at the time, was Salam Fayyad, and he was being hailed in Western capitals as the new Ben Gurion.
Okay.
They were saying, this is a man who understands that it's not about negotiations, it's about building a Palestinian state from the ground up, just like the early Zionists did. And the key to that is training these security forces, Palestinian security forces, with US supervision that's going to lead to Israel feeling secure enough to give Palestinians a state. And I came and I did a reporting trip in 2010 on this, and came away with a very critical take on it, which was an anomalous view at the time. And out of that piece, which got some attention because it was very critical of this project and said, actually, this isn't going to lead to Palestinian statehood, it's only making it easier for Israel to continue to keep this system in place indefinitely, an organization called the International Crisis Group offered me a job, and they said, where would you like to go? They said, anywhere. The head of the Middle East program asked me, and I said, I'd like to go to Gaza. And within weeks of this article being published, I found myself in Gaza for the first time in my life. And I lived there for a month and a half initially, writing a report, and I came back after that. And they hired me, and I moved to Jerusalem in 2011 with my 6-week-old daughter. And we've been there ever since.
Now, it's unusual, your position, because the vast majority, having been in Israel myself, have seen those birthright buses and they're traveling around. And the vast majority of diaspora Jews will go back to Israel and become Zionists. And you went to Israel and became the opposite.
Yes.
So is that a difficult position to be in Jerusalem?
It's definitely, to say a minority is grossly understating it. Yeah, I think that for me personally, it's okay. I mean, I'm an outsider there. I'm not an Israeli citizen. I'm there as a journalist. I think there are certain advantages to being an outsider to the society. But it is, of course, deeply alienating when you're walking around and you feel that basically everyone around you is either supportive or just indifferent to, millions of people who are deprived of basic civil rights indefinitely, over half a century now. And I can't not go out in that society and think that all the time, and I'm a freak for thinking this as I'm buying my coffee or what have you.
And can you tell me, just before we start on the book, what is the mood like? Because anybody who's visited Jerusalem, there is a thing called Jerusalem syndrome, and it does get into you. There's no doubt, even if you go for a couple of days or you go for a couple of weeks, there is something about the city.
Why do you think I've grown my hair like this?
Well, I was saying, exactly, yeah. Slightly, but you have a crucifix around the corner, you never know, it could be empty. But the point is that it does have this feeling. It's the layers of the history, it's the three faiths, it's the politics, it's the culture. What is the feeling there, just before we start right now? And how has that changed since October 7th?
So, on the surface, life has kind of resumed to normal. In the immediate aftermath of October 7th, there was kind of a COVID-like atmosphere. Streets were empty, cafes were empty, there wasn't really much traffic. And now all of that is back. The streets are full, the restaurants are full, and even there are news stories about how Israelis are traveling in large numbers abroad again. So there is this kind of normalcy on one level, and on another level, if you ask anybody how they're doing, they'll shrug, and everybody is, in some way, will say that they're depressed.
Okay. Now that's the Israeli side. Let's talk about the book. The book, I'd like you to tell the story of the book. I've read it, I've been fascinated by it. It produces the gamut of emotions. Okay, we'll go from here to there. Tell us the story of the book, tell us about the individuals involved, and then we can talk about the ramifications and the consequences of the story.
Yeah. So the book tells the story of a tragic bus accident that occurred in 2012 in the greater Jerusalem area. And this was a bus full of Palestinian kindergartners who live in a walled-off enclave. The walls of this enclave are about 3 kilometers from my home. I would pass it all the time and hardly pay it any attention. But the lives of the people on the other side of this enclave are radically different than mine. Half of them are within the municipality of Jerusalem. They're paying taxes to the Jerusalem municipality. They're receiving virtually no services. The police are really only entering in the form of raids, and even the emergency services will refuse to go in without a police or army escort. You have about 130,000 people living in this walled-off enclave today. It has 2 exits, one through a checkpoint into the rest of the city, one into the rest of the West Bank. And as in the rest of East Jerusalem, there's a huge shortage in classrooms. Over 2,000 classrooms are missing, and you have schools operating in double shifts. The one school offered by the municipality in this area is in a former goat pen. And so these parents are faced with a choice of where to send their kids to school. They could send them to the school in the former goat pen. If they can afford it, they can send them to private schools within the enclave, some of them not within municipal Jerusalem, but within the unannexed part of the West Bank. And the other option is to have their kids go to schools on the other side of the wall if they have the right color ID, and then they're facing soldiers every morning, which is a frightening thing for any parent. So what they wound up doing, the children in this story had parents who could afford to send them to a school in Anata, the town inside this enclave that's been partially annexed by Israel in 1967. And because the school has a mixed group of children within it, some of them come from families with green West Bank IDs, which prohibit going into the rest of Jerusalem. Some of them have blue Jerusalem IDs that allow them to go through that checkpoint. They are not able to go to a play area just on the other side of the wall. There's a Jewish settlement of Pisgat Ze'ev just on the other side of the wall, and this bus full of children can't go there. There are no play areas inside this enclave. There aren't even sidewalks. The roads are in disrepair, and you have one very narrow road is the main thoroughfare cutting through this enclave for 130,000 people. When a bus needs to pass me as I go to the homes of the people here, I need to pull in my side mirror just to kind of barely squeak by a bus moving in the opposite direction. And this is how these people are living day in and day out. It takes hours just to exit the enclave. So on this morning in February 2012, these children had plans to go to a play area that they could access by leaving the enclave and following the circuitous path of this wall to an area that's still in Jerusalem, but at the very edge of Ramallah. And on their way there, they passed through a checkpoint and they were struck by a giant semi-trailer. And this semi-trailer was on its way to a settlement quarry where it was taking rocks from the West Bank and bringing them to a factory in the Atarot industrial zone in East Jerusalem, a settlement industrial zone, for the paving of roads inside Israel. And the school bus flipped over on its side, it caught on fire, and because this accident took place in an area that, first of all, on a road that's used primarily by Palestinians, and in an area of utter neglect by Israel, and also an area where the Palestinian Authority is not allowed to go, there was a very predictable delay in any kind of emergency response. It was more than 30 minutes before the first Israeli fire truck arrived at the scene.
30 minutes.
More than 30 minutes. And during that time, it was people, Palestinians, who'd used this road who were left to try to rescue these children. One man in particular who lived in this area heroically entered the bus with one of the school teachers and pulled out dozens of children and kept re-entering this burning bus. He was the only one to do it besides a teacher who passed away in the process of saving these children. And the title character of the book is a man named Abed Salama, who is a father of one of the children on this bus. And we learn about Abed's journey to find out what happened to his son. By the time he reaches the site of the accident, he sees the burned out shell of a bus, he sees an enormous crowd, and people in the crowd are telling him that all the children are gone. They've all been taken away. They've been taken away in private cars by the bystanders who are there, and they're taken in different directions because some of those bystanders have green West Bank IDs. They can't access the superior Jerusalem hospitals that are very close by. Some do have blue Jerusalem IDs, so they can access those hospitals. And when Abed reaches this accident site, he asks where the children are. And he's told all kinds of different answers. They're at one East Jerusalem hospital, they're at another East Jerusalem hospital, they're at the military base a minute up the road, they're at the Ramallah hospital. So he goes to the one place that he can actually access, which is the Ramallah hospital. He calls on relatives who have blue IDs to go look for his son at the other hospitals. And I tell, it's called A Day in the Life of Abed Salama, but it's also the life of Abed Salama.
It's an extraordinary, we talk about, can I just stop you there?
Yeah.
The blue and the green IDs, this is something, the pettiness of the occupation amazes me on a daily basis. So just explain to me and ourselves, who gets the ID, who gets the most restricted one, who gets the most, if you can use this word, liberal one,
Yeah.
and why?
Yeah. So I would answer that in a very brief way, but then zoom out to a bigger picture. And the basic answer is that you have the vast majority of Palestinians in the West Bank cannot access parts of the occupied territory, namely East Jerusalem, which is not just what was Jordanian East Jerusalem, but the lands of more than 24 villages that were annexed by Israel in 1967. And so those people need to apply for one of many dozens of kinds of permits in order to try and get access to either East Jerusalem or Israel itself, where there are much higher paying jobs.
They're in prison, they're trapped.
So they are living, 80-90% of the Palestinians in the West Bank are living in what is known as Area A or B. And so during the Oslo process, what Israel did was it divided the West Bank into 3 zones, excluding the territory of Jerusalem and these surrounding villages that it annexed. And Area C was the area for all Israeli settlements and for all settlement infrastructure, every Israeli base, every Israeli firing zone, every Israeli settler road. So anywhere you could find an Israeli, that was going to be Area C, and it's contiguous. It's more than 60% of the West Bank, and it's one contiguous zone. Within it are dotted a bunch of little areas of limited Palestinian autonomy. These are known as Area A and B, and there are 165 of these little islands. And the basic process over the years has been Israeli expansion in Area C, Israeli dispossession of Palestinians in Area C, and the constriction of Palestinians in these A and B pockets into tighter and tighter little ghettos, like the town of Anata, where these children come from. But to zoom out a little bit, so just to give it the overall picture, in the territory under Israel's control, the areas of limited Palestinian autonomy, so areas A and B and Gaza together, comprise 10% of the area under Israel's control. And these are all disconnected from one another. And demographically, what you have is 7 million Palestinians and 7 million Jews, all living under Israeli rule, all of them having the Israeli High Court of Justice as the court of last resort. And the Jews all have full and equal rights no matter where they live. The Palestinians have variegated sets of rights depending on where they are. And the most limited set of rights is for Palestinian refugees who can't even enter the occupied territories or Israel. And I'm not counting those in the 7 million, that's another several million. And then the next most restricted is Gazans. And Gazans are totally enclosed inside this enclave. Only those who get rare, VIP permits as wealthy businessmen, or if you have a medical case, or if you're, at the peak there were 15 to 18,000 work permits given to Palestinians in Gaza to enter Israel on a limited basis, and that's out of a population of 2.3 million people. So these people did not see the outside world, and they were trapped, and even to go and attend, a university in the West Bank was next to impossible.
For Gazans?
For Gazans,
okay.
Yeah. The next most limited group are the residents of Area C of the West Bank, where they need to get Israeli permission to build a balcony or an outhouse or any kind of structure. And Israel rejects virtually every one of these applications. So people are forced to build without permission, and their structures are destroyed. And what you have in Area C is destruction of Palestinian structures and building of settlements. Right. And that's the overall picture we've seen for decades. And that is, by the way, under every Israeli government. That's not left or right question. And then the next most limited group are the Palestinians who live in Area A and B, where you can have a more of a kind of a bubble of Palestinian autonomy. Israel will still do raids on a nightly or weekly basis into these towns, where the town of Anata has been experiencing nightly raids in recent months. But there is some kind of limited autonomy, and you do have less of a sense of direct confrontation with settlers coming and trying to push you off of the land. And then the next group is the residents of East Jerusalem. They're the ones who have the blue ID. That gives them freedom of movement within the West Bank and into East Jerusalem and Israel. They are not able to vote in national elections, but they can vote in municipal elections. And then
Are these the residents of the old city? You know, when you go
Yes.
to the old city of Jerusalem, it feels, large parts of it feel very Palestinian.
Yes.
These are these people.
These are the residents of the old city, and also all of the area that
Just
Israel
outside the walls.
annexed in 1967. So
Okay.
it's the old city, it's the area around the old city that was Jordanian East Jerusalem until 1967, and it's the lands of these 26 villages. So a place like Anata, it was partially annexed. Because again, the overriding principle for Israel has always been maximum land, minimum Arabs. So that's why you don't have the annexation of a whole town. You have Israel annexing as much land as they can that's relatively sparsely populated.
harnessing the
getting
Arabs
up
into one area.
And then getting right up until the downtown area of the village, which they say, they don't want. So anyone who's in these over 24 annexed villages or in annexed East Jerusalem, they are with a blue ID. And then the best category are Palestinian citizens of Israel. Those are those who stayed inside the state after the 1948 war. They were not forced to flee. Some of them are internally dispossessed, so they did flee, but not beyond the borders of what became Israel. And they were then put under a military government for the first 18 years of the state, from 1948 to 1966. And they had curfews, permits, land areas that they could not access, that Jews could access. It was basically the model of the occupation that we have today.
So you have various gradients of, humiliation. I mean, I remember myself going to Bethlehem from the old city and just feeling that extraordinary change in the vibe on the bus as we crossed the old Green Line and went into what was the West Bank and the Israeli. And it was just, what struck me was just this was in the late 90s. This was low-level harassment. But now we're talking about, the book evidences this extraordinary mix of, it's like being in a prison in your own country.
Yeah.
Now, let's go back to the family. The little boy, Milad, the mother, Haifa, and the dad, Abed. Tell me about these people.
So Abed is an extraordinary person, and through his life story, we really learn the whole story of Palestine in this book. He was born shortly after the occupation began. He finished high school just before the first Intifada. He became active in the first Intifada, when his brother-in-law was arrested. He then became, at a very young age, the local leader of the leftist faction that he was part of, the Democratic Front for the Liberation of Palestine. He was arrested, like almost all of the activists around him, taken in the middle of the night, blindfolded, soldiers jumping on the heads of these blindfolded Palestinians in the Jeep on the way to the detention facility. And then he was interrogated and tortured. He was placed in a number of different prisons. One of them was inside a military base that was on his own family land, just across from the village. And then he wound up spending time, like many Palestinians, in a prison in the Negev desert called Ketziot. And there were a huge number of Palestinians who were arrested at that time. He wasn't allowed any kind of family visitation and was even afraid to write letters to his love. There's a lot about his early love stories.
There's also a great love story at the center of the book too. I mean, it's got everything. This media is everything.
And part of the idea of the book was, through Abed's story, you could see how this system of control reaches the most intimate aspects of his life. So much so that at one point, he has a higher paying job in Jerusalem, and the permit regime is getting tighter and tighter and more restrictive. And he and his co-workers are at risk of losing their jobs. And what some of them do, including Abed, is they begin to look for a marriage partner who has the right color ID, who has a blue ID, through which they could keep their jobs.
Makes complete sense.
Yeah.
But this is what comes down the book is, as you say, the level of personal interference.
Yes.
And the choices that people are making on a daily basis are so compromised
Yes.
by all these various bureaucratic,
Yes.
bizarre sort of. I mean, this is apartheid. This
Yes.
is exactly what it is. It's,
Yes.
it's exactly what they had in the past laws in South Africa.
Yes. And every leading activist from South Africa, anti-apartheid activist who comes, they not only say that this is apartheid when they come to Israel-Palestine, but they frequently say this is worse. And of course, the two systems are different, but in South Africa, they made a distinction between petty apartheid and grand apartheid. Petty apartheid was separate water fountains, separate beaches, separate. Yeah. And there's a lot less of that in Israel-Palestine. But what you do have to a very high degree is the grand apartheid, which is about segregating populations and taking over land and constricting one group into very, very small zones while the other group expands and takes over the land.
So let's go back to the day. Let's go back to the crash. Let's go back to Milad, little boy, to Abed's wife, to the family.
Yeah.
Because these are people you really got to know.
Absolutely, yeah. So, the process of reporting this book was spending many, many hours every week with Abed for years. And it was more than just reporting, it was almost like therapy at points. And this is something that Abed, I can say, has never gotten over, much more so than other parents whom I spoke to. He still has Milad as his image on his WhatsApp profile, and
Milad was 9 years old?
Milad was 5.
5, wow.
And he yearns to talk about his son. And he was surrounded by a cloud of silence before I came to him. And everybody was afraid of upsetting him by talking about anything connected to the accident or to Milad. And so when
where did he eventually find out that Milad was one of the children who died?
He didn't find out until the following day. Okay. That it took hours and hours until they finally did a DNA test of him and his son, as another son, Adam, and his wife, Haifa. And then the following day, and they still had reason to hope that night, even after the DNA test, there were other kids who were not found until the following day. There were still kids who were missing. They could tell themselves that maybe some Bedouin family had taken the kids in, or they were still at a military base that Israeli soldiers had taken them to. There were semi-plausible stories. They could tell themselves that he was still alive. And yeah, it was more than 24 hours after the crash before he found out.
But, what's clear to the book is, had this happened in Israel, or had this accident happened in Dunleary or Dalkey, the emergency services would have been there in minutes, and most of those kids would have survived.
Yes.
That's the key.
Yes.
But because of all the limitations and the restrictions, and frankly, because they were Palestinian kids,
yes,
nobody was allowed to go. That's right. The bizarre. There was a checkpoint a couple of 100 yards away with Israeli soldiers.
Yep. They refused.
They refused to go near them.
The crowds came to them and begged them to come, and they refused.
And so there was no fire brigade, there was no ambulance, there was nothing.
Yes.
There were just Palestinians with their own
ordinary civilians putting these 5-year-old soot-covered children into the back seats of these cars and driving off in different directions. And, some of the reviews of the book have described it as an accident a story of an accident that wasn't really an accident. And I think that what's meant by that is exactly what you're pointing to, which is, of course, the event itself is an accident. The driver of the semi-trailer did not intend to crash into the bus. But all of the events that transpired that morning after the crash were entirely predictable. And we see predictable tragedy all the time on the other side of the wall. After the accident happened, you had a fire in a similar neighborhood, which is within Jerusalem, but on the other side of the wall, and the fire trucks were not allowed to come, and ordinary citizens are just trying to deal with the fire, and people died. You have a man who had a heart attack inside the same enclave that the children in Abed live in, where the emergency services weren't allowed to go in. Actually, the ambulance workers were so outraged that they just disobeyed the orders and abandoned the ambulance and ran through the checkpoint on foot to try and rescue this person who'd had a heart attack. He didn't survive. So the policy that operates is one of deliberate neglect. And the basic reason is because this is happening in the greater Jerusalem area, the number one priority area for Israeli settlement. And the desire is to have Palestinians move elsewhere, to go to Ramallah, to go to some other area, so that this region can be entirely Jewish and you can have a contiguous Jewish presence to all these outlying settlements.
When you're in Jerusalem, here we hear of the two-state solution. If we just get a bit political about it now, is that even viable now? Given, the fact that you present in the book of the daily life, of the sort of, as I say, humiliations, harassments, terrorizing a population, as you said, squeezing them. Is there a two-state? In your mind, as somebody's lived there for a long time, does it exist even? Or is that rhetoric at the UN and rhetoric at Parliament?
So one of my great frustrations in talking about Israel-Palestine is that this potential outcome of a two-state solution and other potential outcomes, they're talked about at such length that they have become reified. It's almost as though they are not theoretical possibilities, but real things in the world that are more important than the reality on the ground that we have today. And so you'll have governments condemning X or Y behavior on the grounds that it harms this hypothetical outcome. And what I feel that that's all part of is trying to reinforce the notion that this is all temporary. We don't need to really deal with this issue right now. It's going to be resolved. It's a temporary occupation. Yes, it's gone on for 57 years, but it's eventually going to go away. And at the end of the day, Israel is going to have to decide. They're going to have to choose. They can't continue like this forever. It's unsustainable.
That's the mainstream view here.
Yes.
And in this part of the world.
Yes. So the basic idea of, also John Kerry and other diplomats is Israel is going to have to choose. They're going to have to one day either give Palestinians equal rights and citizenship, or they're going to have to give them what the PLO is demanding, a Palestinian state on 22% of the Palestinian homeland. And for me, I have long believed and written that Israel does not have to choose. And this entire construct that Israel will have to choose and we can sit back because Israel's going to make this choice in its own self-interest is a big part of the problem. And it's what allows the system to continue as long as it has. Israel has another option, which is the status quo, which is continued expansion, continued control, with the continued deprivation of basic civil rights to millions of people. And that is what will continue so long as the incentives that exist today are there.
Because it's interesting you talk about the South African parallel. There seems to be this sort of mythical idea that an FW de Klerk will emerge from Israel.
Yes.
And that de Klerk will take his people in a direction. So if you think about the Afrikaners in the late 1980s, the white people eventually said, hold on, this can't go on, we've got to cut a deal. That seems to be the model that a lot of Europeans and Americans are hoping for.
Yes.
But what you're saying is these are very different situations. And the actual DNA of the problem is very different.
True, but also that, I'm not a big believer in the importance of some heroic Messiah-like figure who's going to come in. De Klerk emerged out of a very specific set of circumstances, which was, in fact, a change in the incentive structure for Afrikaners. There was the equivalent of an uprising in South Africa in the 1980s. There was extreme pressure. There was a reduction in Western support, sanctions, ostracism of South Africa. And if you listen to interviews with the finance minister of South Africa from the 80s, he said, we had a boot on our neck. We had a boot on our neck, and we had to get it off. And so I believe that ultimately the incentives are much more important than the particular leader, and even a right-wing leader will operate according to the actual interests that he has in front of him.
Can I also ask you, is there an Israeli point of view that is reasonable? Is there, when you go to Israel as an outsider, when you talk to a lot of Israelis, I always feel that there's a particular echo of trauma amongst them. There's a fear, sometimes irrational fear, when you see the absolute disparity of power on both sides. Do you understand, not so much the settlers, but that the middle ground Israelis who themselves seem to be quite traumatized and themselves have a lot of fear? We might feel those fears to be irrational, but they have it.
Yeah. So the thing that you just mentioned about the great disparity on between the sides, I think the disparity is that Israel has all the power and the Palestinians have none. So that would be an argument against the fear driving anything. Yeah, I think the fear obviously is real. These are descendants of people who've been traumatized in all kinds of ways, but I think that the overall feeling that I get from this kind of center-left crowd, the people who came out in very large numbers prior to October 7th, who were coming out against the judicial reform in Israel. These were known as the Kaplan protests. It was hundreds of thousands of people were coming out into the street. These were very big numbers. And the headline of those protests was, "We are fighting for democracy." Now, why did those hundreds of thousands of people come out? Basically, it was a Kulturkampf where they felt that the state, they were secular and the state was sliding into theocracy. And they were coming out because they worried that their interests as Jews for the first time were at risk, that their rights as Jews for the first time were at risk because of this theocratic slide. And they're going out and they're protesting for democracy. And at night, they're taking Zoom classes on democratic principles from professors in different universities. And it was just jaw-dropping to me to have democracy be the headline of this thing and no discussion of how could we even call this place a democracy when for over 57 years, millions of people, based on their inborn characteristics, are deprived of basic civil rights. So my feeling is that that center-left that might in a poll say, I would support a two-state solution, when it comes down to it, they're content with indefinite control. They're not coming out in big numbers for an end to the deprivation of rights for Palestinians, and that allows for an environment in which governments of left, right, and center all pursue the same policy. There's a tendency in the Western press to demonize Netanyahu. He's the source of all evil.
He's kind of convenient, isn't he?
Yeah, very convenient. But it's historically ignorant because the settlement project began with left governments. With the first 10 years of the occupation, those first 50 settlements, those were done by the Mapai and Labor governments. And we have had every government pursue this same policy in the West Bank. We had Netanyahu gone just a couple of years ago. We had a centrist government.
Barak and these guys.
With Yair Lapid was the alternate prime minister, together with Naftali Bennett. And Yair Lapid, while he was the alternate prime minister in this government, he said, well, there's nothing to talk to the Palestinians about, and we're certainly not going to talk to them about a Palestinian state. So again, it's very easy to just sit with the status quo and prolong it. And the force that actually wants to do something to end it and to really pay a price to do that is very, very small.
Can we go back to the family? Can we go back to Abed? Can we go back to his life? How are they living right now? How is he living right now? And what does he see as the future, as a potential future?
Yeah. Abed and I were on a book tour together for this book, beginning October 3rd when it was published.
It's very good timing.
And immediately after October 7th, this town that he comes from was entirely closed down. So 130,000 people locked inside, his wife and family and children trapped in this walled ghetto. And all it takes is 4 soldiers to do it. 2 at the checkpoint at one end, and then 2 pushing a roadblock into the single road exiting at the other end, and that's it. So he cut the tour short to be with his family. The main employment sector with high-paying jobs for Palestinians is in Israel and the settlements. And those jobs have all but entirely dried up since October 7th. Israeli and settler employers do not want Palestinians to return. And so they are feeling great constriction economically. Their freedom of movement, now they can exit the enclave, but all kinds of other restrictions of movement around it have popped up. So it now takes hours to go distances that once took a half an hour in the West Bank. When I asked Abed, and I've asked other people too, when is the period of the worst restrictions on movement that you have faced? And what we're talking about, we say restrictions on movement, what we mean is you cannot plan your day. You cannot go and say, I'm going to meet someone because of the whim of a 19-year-old who's going to decide to hold you up for 4 or 6 hours. So those restrictions on movement, Abed says, are the worst he's ever experienced in his entire life, worse even than the Second Intifada, and many other Palestinians have said that to me. When I went and had a dinner at his home during Ramadan, an iftar dinner, he has a brother who he's very close to who lives in Ramallah. And that brother had not left Ramallah in half a year. He hadn't left his little enclave because there's settler violence on the road. 500 Palestinians have been killed by the army or settlers since October 7th in the West Bank. You have over 1,000 that have been forcibly dispossessed since October 7th in the West Bank. You have entire communities that have been obliterated inside the West Bank since October 7th. And on top of this, you have a great deal of depression and grief over what everybody's watching all day in Gaza. Abed has relatives who have lost family in Gaza. His wife, Haifa, a close relative of hers, was one of the 500 who was killed in these last 8 months in the West Bank. He was just on his way to his job in Ramallah, and there was an arrest operation happening a block away. And they didn't like the presence of this guy during this arrest operation, and he was killed. So the environment in the West Bank is very, very tense right now.
Ladies and gentlemen, unfortunately, and I think it is very much unfortunately, we are out of time. But I think we have been really, really fortunate to hear Nathan Thrall today. Nathan Thrall, ladies and gentlemen.
Thank you.